Later today, Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin will be meeting face to face at Elmendorf Air Force Base in Alaska. Now, this is the first face to face meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, of course, since Trump's first term. And in addition to that, it is the first face to face meeting between any high level official and an American president since Russia started this illegal war of aggression and genocide through its unprovoked invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. Now, we would ordinarily know what was going to be discussed in a very high level diplomatic visit like this. However, it's the Trump administration and it is a completely chaotic situation. This actually arises out of Steve Witkoff's disastrous meeting with Vladimir Putin about a week and a half ago, where he gave three different offers from Russia to the Ukrainians and the Europeans, all of which were totally inconsistent. So when you have a disastrous meeting that is filled with confusion, that is the genesis of a meeting between two presidents. It's going to be very disorganized, and that's what we have. Recall that Witkoff gave these three different offers on 3 different days. The first day was Russia will agree to a ceasefire and freeze the current line of contact. The offer on the second day was that Russia will agree to that, plus, but they want a land swap. Basically, they will give back Ukraine all of Zaporizhia and Kherson Oblast if Ukraine gives up Donetsk Oblast. Then the third day, and as you can see, these get progressively worse, it was that Russia will basically agree to nothing, maybe a ceasefire, if Ukraine gives up everything, including all of Donetsk Oblast, and the people who live there would have to agree to be under Russian occupation, which is hell. So that's where we are. Now, Trump has described this variously throughout the week as a feeling out process, as a face to face, maybe a discussion about a ceasefire, possibly trying to even reach some initial terms on ending the war. Nobody really knows. What we are aware of is the fact that this is a complete and gigantic mistake for the United States and its leadership and reputation throughout the world. It is rewarding Russia, which has done nothing to show that it is ready to end this war on any kind of terms that are acceptable to the Americans, to the Europeans, or the Ukrainians. Very specifically, Russia has doubled its aerial attacks on civilians, has doubled its war crimes since Trump took office, and every single time that Trump has asked the Russians to agree to a ceasefire, they respond with basically a middle finger and amplify their attacks even more. That's where we're at. So this meeting should not even be happening. Additionally, if you look at the delegation that went, includes Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, who really has no basis to go unless they're going to be discussing some kind of, financial incentives or trying to end sanctions. We'll get to that in a second, how the United States is restricted from doing that, or has some restrictions on doing that. And yet they did not have Keith Kellogg actually going, who is the envoy from the United States on Ukraine to Russia. And again, that is capitulating to Russia. They do not like Keith Kellogg because he is pro-Ukraine. He has the correct view of the situation. He understands Russian imperialism, having been a general in the U.S. military during the Cold War. So he was raised in Europe and understands what Russia is really about and their threat and their menace, which has continued, basically since World War II. Now, there are a lot of wild claims that have been going around that maybe Trump would be trying to induce Russia to agree to a ceasefire by giving them the rights to Alaskan minerals, other things like that. But I think basically, don't look too much into these reports. We're going to know soon enough what's actually being discussed. Understand and remember that the EU is America's largest trading partner, and Trump would be wise not to screw up that relationship in order to just have limited trade with a completely corrupt country like Russia. Now, let's talk about sanctions. Can those possibly be lifted? Actually, there's a lot of limitations on that. So what you have first is that the federal law that actually passed those sanctions on Russia in 2017, which Marco Rubio assisted with drafting and getting passed, and when he was the head of the Senate Intelligence Committee, basically restrict Trump from lifting any sanctions on Russia without congressional approval. Now, Congress has been very pliable and basically doing anything that Trump wants. They've gotten ridiculous nominees through like Tulsi Gabbard, RFK Jr., Pete Hegseth. So it's possible they could agree to that. But there are still a lot of very strong, very staunch pro-Ukraine supporters in Congress, and especially Republicans in the Senate. Now, the other problem with lifting sanctions, the other limitation, is the fact that Europe has to agree to them. And if Europe doesn't agree to them, then it's not going to work because there's so much that has to go through Europe, so much trade that involves Europe. You have to get their buy-in. Otherwise, if you're lifting sanctions, they're effectively not going to be lifted at all as a practical matter. Additionally, Europe has the bulk of frozen assets, 200 billion of, I believe, about 300 billion. So they have tremendous leverage, and their input is going to be essential and required. Now, Trump has clarified in the past 24 hours that Ukraine's input and agreement to any territorial swap or any territorial issues will be necessary, and he's not going to try to negotiate in their absence. Earlier in the week, he had somewhat outrageously said that he was mad at Zelensky for Volodymyr Zelensky for basically, he suggested that he's the one who started the war and that he should just give up territories without approval of their legislature in Ukraine, known as the Verkhovna Rada. He's come back from that, which is good to hear. Now, in the lead up, Trump has mentioned that, on Air Force One, that Putin's drone attacks have hurt his position. But again, don't read too much into what Trump says from day to day because it changes. It's the core statements and the other restrictive mechanisms in place that truly matter and will guide these discussions. Now, the other thing that's happening today I want to point out is that they're meeting at Elmendorf Air Force Base, which is really, I think, humiliating, maybe too strong of a word, but it is a very, something that I would find very insulting if I worked at that Air Force Base. And here's the reason why. Russian bombers have been threatening Alaska for 50 plus years. Flying off into the air defense identification zone, doing mock, nuclear bombing runs, things of that nature. And the airplanes that intercept that Russian aggression, that protect America, fly from that Air Force base. So imagine being in the Air Force there, and in fact, the enemy that has been threatening you, that you've been basically preparing for and working against, is now being given essentially red carpet treatment. That to me would be very bothersome. It's just something I wanted to point out as a veteran. Now, we have Ukraine and NATO's position statement. And recall that NATO is actually paying for the weapons to be delivered from the United States to Ukraine. And that arrangement, I believe, will continue even if no deal is reached today. Because if the United States backs off of that deal and tries to break that deal, it's going to call into question all of the weapon supplies from the United States to NATO, including, F-35s. I mean, we're talking billions and billions and billions of dollars of contracts that would be at stake if the Europeans feel like they absolutely cannot trust the United States anymore and its word. And let's go through this Ukraine's position statement. And I want to explain why these are important. Okay. Now, Ukraine says it's ready for territorial negotiations on territorial issues, but only based on the contact line and after a ceasefire is in place. Now, the ceasefire is critical. If you don't have the ceasefire, you have no Russian commitment to actually end the war. You cannot prove that they're serious. And what you end up with is a situation where you're relying upon a Russian promise. Russians break their promises. Look at the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, where Ukraine gave up its nuclear arsenal, the third largest in the world, along with a lot of cruise missiles and other strategic weapons, and got totally screwed. So nothing matters that Russia says. It's what Russia does. Now, the central topic, point 2 of this Trump-Putin meeting must be the ceasefire. And obviously I agree. It's got to be action that happens. The Russian word, a Russian promise, utterly worthless. Now, there's 5 joint principles that Ukraine and NATO have agreed upon, including the right to join NATO. And this is important because when we talk about security guarantees for Ukraine, which has to be part of any deal, there were security assurances, guarantees, whatever, you twist the language, in the Budapest Memorandum. Ukraine expected the United States to come to its aid if Russia ever violated that agreement and invaded, which they did. And frankly, the United States has never done enough to actually help Ukraine win the war rather than just prolong it and prevent Russia from, pushing further into that country. So the only security guarantees that matter, or that will take the form of the broad category of security guarantees, is going to have to be either Ukraine joining NATO or arming Ukraine with the most sophisticated American weapons that would basically provide its own security guarantee. Things like Tomahawk cruise missiles, or, long-range weapons, things of that nature. Giving, another one is higher level radars and avionics to the F-16s they have. So that's critical, okay? Legal recognition of territories. of those territories occupied by Russia is not on the table, and nor should it be. If Ukraine agrees to stop the fighting, it doesn't mean they have to agree that the millions of Ukrainians under a Russian occupation who have been basically illegally kidnapped by Russia are part of that country. They're not. They will just use diplomatic means, sanctions, and things of that nature in order to get those territories back rather than invading and continuing to fight this war militarily to get those territories back. The security guarantees, we just talked about that, and there were some proposals that Zelensky discussed joint steps after the summit with Putin, like that last bullet point. We'll see how it goes. I'm not super optimistic. Now, when we move on and we're talking about what happened, in the last 24 to 36 hours, the Russians, because, they like to do horrible things like invade other countries, commit genocide, things I can't even discuss on this video without possibly, getting my account suspended. The Russians show up in Alaska and they start complaining about their accommodations. Now, understand that they asked for over 400 visas because this is a big deal. It's a propaganda event for Russia. They see it as a victory to be able to come to the United States and meet face to face with Donald Trump, an American president. It validates them, and they had so many people coming, there weren't enough hotel rooms. So the Russians, they got to cots and reasonable accommodations, kind of thing that, way better than what POWs get when they're captured by Russia. We'll get to that in a second as well. And they didn't like the food, they didn't like the water. Again, ironic because look at how they treat Ukrainian POWs. Look how they treat people under occupation. POWs are basically starved almost to death. In many cases, they are. God knows what they're being fed. And in the occupied territories, for example, Donetsk Oblast, as you can see, people have to wait days and hours and weeks to get water from a water tanker, standing in line for weeks. Standing in line for hours and hours in the dark just to get water jugs refilled. It is a complete catastrophe, and the irony of Russia complaining about that is really incredible, and it shows you their mentality, and that's a pattern with the Russians. Do horrible things, then complain like you're the victim. Now, Alaskans, I do very much appreciate them because they came out in droves and to show their support for Ukraine. And not only did they come out, to the city to basically demonstrate and show the solidarity that they have with the Ukrainian people, knowing their Russian threat because Russia has been so close to them geographically and has been threatening them for so long, they understand this. It also is consistent with the new polling that shows that 75% of Americans support aid to Ukraine, and that is a huge 20% jump among GOP voters in 2025, which nearly doubled their support from 30 to 51%. And then we have Sergei Lavrov, of course, here he is, showing up in a CCCP, basically a Soviet Union shirt, which is very critical because it is important in messaging. Okay, he is a professional diplomat, and this has something that this is saying something. This is communicating something. It is messaging clearly, and here's what it is: it's imperialistic ambitions that they want to bring back the Soviet Union, that which was on his shirt when Ukraine was fully occupied by the Russians, as were the Baltic states, Poland, Lithuania, and others. And the reason that's important is Russia tries to paint Ukraine as some kind of special case that if they're given territory there, that they're not going to then invade NATO. That's what they say when they want to negotiate. It's not what they say when they go back to their country. It's not what their media says. But this shirt expresses Ukraine is just like Poland, and once we get Ukraine, we're going to invade the rest. It's all the same justification, bringing back the old Soviet Union. And it's incredibly disrespectful, and I hope that gets back to Trump if he's got savvy social media people. We'll see. Now, I think the last thing you really want to expect and understand is there's going to be some very nauseating visuals today that we're going to see. We're going to see an American president stand on the stage with an indicted war criminal, mass murdering lunatic. Okay, someone who has repeatedly disrespected Trump, who has refused to respond and do ceasefires when requested, who has done absolutely nothing asked of him by either Trump or the international community, and it's going to be validating him. Will he be coming out and shaking hands? We saw Steve Witkoff when he meets Trump, and he's like, this is like his bro, or not, when he meets Witkoff, when he meets Putin, it's like, it's his bro, and he's like shaking hands and all excited. This person Vladimir Putin should not be on a U.S. Air Force base. He should not be on American territory. He should be getting arrested right now. And what he's done and what he continues to do every single day is disgusting, disgraceful, and it should never be tolerated in a civilized society. We should have gotten past this in World War II, that we respect the fundamental concept of the territorial sovereignty of people, and that war crimes will always hold you accountable. That's why we had World War II. That's why we had the Nuremberg trials. So it's going to be difficult to swallow. It's basically a free-for-all. We don't know what to expect. So all we can really count on are the core statements and the consistent messaging from the Trump administration, and that the restrictions that really encompass what Trump is able to do with respect to things like sanctions. So we'll see. We'll watch. Definitely will be entertaining. Come back here and we'll talk about the outcomes. No matter what, remember, Ukraine will stand. What they are and what they're going through is something that all of humanity is a part of. We will continue to support them. They will continue to survive, and they will have victory. So don't get too bent out of shape if things go in a negative way today. Ukraine always finds a way, and they will again, no matter what. Thanks, guys. Look forward to talking to you again soon.